So that famous 60-60 dry cure method could be potentially costing you terpenes, potency, and possibly even your lab tests. 60% Fahrenheit, 60% humidity, 14 to 21 days. You've seen it in forums, you hear it in grow rooms, people talk about it like it's gospel. But here's the truth. 60-60 is not a gold standard. It is a compromise that ignores the actual physics and the microbiology of what is happening in your flower during the drying process. Today, we're going to break it all down so by the end of this episode, you'll understand why 60-60 keeps your flowers in the microbial danger zone for far too long, how to set up a faster, controlled dry, the role of water activity and thermodynamics, and the role of vapor pressure deficit in your drying process. You'll get a step-by-step process from pre-harvest all the way to jars. Let's get into it. Let's start with the myth. 60-60 method says to dry your cannabis at 60% Fahrenheit and 60% relative humidity for about 2 to 3 weeks. The idea is low and slow preserves terpenes and gives a smoother smoke. Now on the surface that sounds nice, but the problem doesn't account for water activity inside of the flower. It assumes every cultivar, every bud structure, and every grow needs the same environment, and these parameters may keep your flower in the perfect range for mold and yeast to grow for far too long. When you chop down a plant, the water locked inside those flowers is way above what microbes need to grow. Microbes don't care what your room is set to, they care about how much available is water inside the plant material. At 60% Fahrenheit and 60% relative humidity, the air feels nice and cool, but inside of a dense cola, the water activity could be high for weeks. So while you feel good about your slow dry process, you're actually giving microbes an opportunity to procreate in your flower. Most growers talk about moisture in terms of how it feels or the relative humidity in the room, but the real metric that predicts mold is water activity. Water activity is basically how much available water is inside the product for microbes to use. It's measured on a scale from 0 to 1, pure water being 1, and bone dry material being closer to 0. For cannabis, we want water activity levels to be between 0.55 and 0.62. Most molds and yeasts need around 0.7 and above to grow. So our entire goal when drying is to move the flower down through that danger zone quickly, then stabilize it between 0.55 and 0.62 for storage. We're not taking a guess or gauging how it feels. We're looking at real measurable targets. Now, you're probably wondering what actually makes water leave the plant. We're dealing with the laws of thermodynamics, and you need to remember this phrase. Everything flows down a gradient. Water moves from where there's more energy and more available water to where there's less. When your flower is freshly harvested, the inside is almost like a water balloon, high water activity and high internal vapor pressure. When the air around your flower is drier and slightly warmer, there's a strong gradient. Water wants to leave the plant, evaporate into the air, and equalize that difference. That gradient between the plant and the air is what dries your flower. If the air is too humid, that gradient is weak and water leaves slowly. If the air is too dry and too hot, that gradient is too aggressive and you can dry the outside while the core of the flower is still wet. So you're looking for a controlled, intentional gradient. And vapor pressure deficit, or VPD, is one of the ways to measure that gradient. Higher vapor pressure deficit will exert a stronger drying force, while lower VPD will result in slower drying time. What this means is that the internal parts of that flower will stay in that high water activity, high risk range for days or weeks. Our approach uses 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit and 40 to 45% relative humidity. Our approach uses 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit and 40 to 45% relative humidity, which gives you a higher VPD and a stronger gradient. That lets us move through the danger zone faster without drying out the flower too quickly. So the science involves water activity, thermodynamic gradients, and vapor pressure deficit. Now I want to talk to you about how to actually run this program in the grow. Now, the drying process doesn't start when you cut the plant down. Step one actually starts pre-harvest with a dry back. A few days before harvest, in the last several days, you should run a controlled dry back on the root zone. This means no heavy saturations or heavy irrigations right before chop. Let the pots or beds get lighter, let the soil or media dry out, and you should see a reduction in leaf tugger without letting them wilt. The idea is to remove excess water from the plant while it's still alive. You're lowering the total water load and the internal water activity before the plant ever hits the dry room. Step 2 is defoliation. When it's time to harvest, strip off all of the big fan leaves because basically they're just giant water pads. And whenever possible, hang whole plants or at least large branches. Fan leaves hold a ton of extra water, but don't add to the quality of the final product. So by removing them, you can reduce how much water has to be removed post-harvest. Hanging whole plants or larger branches gives you some structural buffer. It slows the outside dry just enough that you don't desiccate the outer layer while the middle layer is still moist. Step 3 is to set up your dry room. You want to dry between 70 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit and between 40 and 45% relative humidity for around 7 to 8 days. However, some varieties, depending on their density of the flower and the size of the plants, may take an additional few days. You also want gentle indirect airflow. You don't want to place fans directly blowing on drying plants, and you want to keep everything in the dark without direct sunlight. With these settings, vapor pressure deficit is higher and water activity inside the bud drops faster, and you move more quickly through that 0.7 plus range where mold and yeasts grow. And because the temperature is still reasonable and the airflow is gentle, you're not degrading terpenes. You typically run this for around 7 to 8 days, but the calendar is just a guide. The real indicators are stem snap, and the outside of the bud should feel dry while the core still has a little bit of give. Step 4 is the toting phase. And the goal during this process is to homogenize moisture. Once the stems of the flower snap off the stalk, you can buck all of the untrimmed flower into totes, and you want to keep those totes about 75% full and place a lid on that is not airtight for around 2 to 3 days. Now, during this process, you want to make sure that once or twice daily you mix up the flour to help homogenize and redistribute that moisture that's trapped inside of the flower evenly through the rest of the flower. And it's at this point that the outer layer of the bud is much drier than the inner core. But over the course of these 2 or 3 days, the water will migrate and diffuse from the wetter core to the drier outside. Tissue and moisture levels will homogenize across the flower. And step 5 is really important. It's trimming without rehydrating your flower. If your dry room is nice and controlled at 45 or 40 RH and it's cool, like 70 degrees, and you bring that into an environment that has a higher relative humidity, the flower will reabsorb water. So the simple rule is don't trim in an environment that is more humid than your dry room. Ideally, you want to trim in the same room or at least conditions similar to the space that you dry in. Step 6 is checking water activity levels after trimming. You don't want to put anything into jars until you've met the proper requirements for water activity levels. Between 0.55 and 0.62 is ideal. Below 0.65, mold and yeast can't really grow. And above 0.55, the product isn't too dry that it makes it harsh and lifeless. If you don't have a meter, you can put a small sample of trim flour into a small sealed container and drop a high quality digital hydrometer and just let it sit for like 12 to 24 hours. And if that jar stabilizes around 55% relative humidity, you're pretty close to the right target water activity range. And then the last stage is storage. Once you've hit that proper water activity level window, you can jar up your flour without concern of microbial contamination. This last process also helps to redistribute and homogenize any remaining moisture, and it can also help slow the chemical changes that occur over time. It can help soften the smoke and redefine the aroma, but you should not be constantly burping jars because if you are, it means that you've jarred too wet. Remember to keep your jars and your bags in a cool, dark environment to maintain the integrity of your product.